Can my fermentation be saved if this is growing on top of it? Hi there, I'm doing a video series on Fermentation Funk so you know how to identify what's what, is it safe or not, and what to do about it. This is video number 2 and I'll be discussing mold. Now video number 1 covered calm yeast, and if you haven't seen it yet, be sure to go back and watch that video after this one. You'll find the link in the description. As for today, we're going to dive into the topic of mold, from different colors, different scenarios, when to toss it, and when it can possibly be saved. Plus, I'll show you several demonstrations so you can actually see what I'm talking about. Let's get started. If we're going to talk about mold on fermentations, then we gotta at least first cover the quick basics. Molds are a natural part of the environment and can be found almost anywhere that moisture and oxygen are present. Molds produce tiny spores to reproduce. These mold spores waft through the indoor and outdoor air continually, and when mold spores land on a damp spot, they may begin flourishing and digesting whatever they're growing on in order to survive, such as wood, carpet, soil, and of course, food. When it comes to fermenting vegetables, the opportunity for mold to develop is when the equipment isn't properly cleaned beforehand, the fermentation is not properly made, or it's not properly cared for during or after the fermentation period. Mold will grow where there's a symbiotic combination of oxygen, moisture, warmth, and a digestible energy source like what we just talked about. If you think about it, the top of a fermentation can be the perfect host. Which leads us to the importance of brine in vegetable fermentation. Brine is the greatest protector of a ferment. The brine used for vegetable fermentation must be a minimum of 2% salt or higher in order for it to inhibit mold and other pathogens. So the salt content of the brine, the absence of oxygen in the brine, plus the acidic pH will protect the vegetables submerged beneath it. A compromise of any of those brine conditions just mentioned can open a doorway that risks the safety of the food submerged beneath the brine. When it comes to how mold is dealt with, there isn't one protocol that all fermenters follow. It is, however, a consensus that you never want to directly eat mold growing on a vegetable fermentation. And if there's any offensive smell or other signs of spoilage with your fermentation, mold or not, throw it away. So the debate in the fermenting world is not whether or not you can directly eat mold on a vegetable fermentation. The answer is unanimously no. Rather, the debate is this: are the vegetables that are submerged in the brine under the surface mold safe to eat or not? I have two fermenting gurus in mind with polar opposite approaches to mold. Both are very experienced, competent, and knowledgeable. Both are even professional fermenting instructors. The first instructor says that with any sign of mold, even a small amount, it is unacceptable, dangerous, and the entire fermentation should be thrown away. Why? Because molds produce mycotoxins and antibiotics that can infiltrate the fermentation and be harmful to human health. On the other hand, the second instructor says white to gray mold, even some colored molds, are not a problem. Simply scrape the mold off the top of the fermentation, and the vegetables submerged below in the brine are still perfectly good to eat. Being given, of course, as long as there's no other signs of spoilage. I'm going to share with you how I handle mold on my own fermentations, which seems to be somewhere in the middle of those two instructors' viewpoints. But here's a rhetorical question that I've considered. Cheese. What do we commonly do with mold on cheese? We cut the moldy outer part off, but most of us don't toss out the whole block or wheel after the surface mold is cut off. We eat from the good portion of cheese remaining, right? And yet, here we are, still alive to tell the tale. However, I'll reiterate that I do not recommend anyone eating mold, period. I'm going to start with a demonstration of a tiny bit of mold development in example number 1, then show increasingly progressive mold developments with each following demonstration. Here's an excerpt from my fermented pickles video. As for the crock, it had quite the calm yeast bloom on top, along with a speck of mold. For a little mold removal like this, use a spoon to lift it out. If you want to see how I remove the calm yeast from those pickles, go back and watch video number 1 in this series, where I show you how to remove calm yeast. For just a little bit of floating mold like this, what I do is just like with the speck of mold on the pickle brine, I use a clean spoon and lift it out. The fermented food beneath the brine should be just fine. Next, I'll show you a demonstration of mold removal from a fermented kale I did, where I used a cabbage leaf as a topper. It's been 7 days and 2 different scenarios turned out for these identically made fermented kales. With this jar, the cabbage leaf topper did not stay submerged under the brine due to insufficient weight to hold it down. Parts of the leaf dried out and other parts began to mold. The top of the kale that was in contact with the moldy leaf was also not fully submerged under the brine, and there was a few small mold specks beginning to form. So small actually the camera really even couldn't pick it up. However, for me, this is not a lost cause. Here's what I did. I used a clean fork and removed the top portion of the kale and threw it out along with the top cabbage leaf. The healthy and protected fermented kale beneath the brine was in my comfort zone to eat. In comparison, this fermented kale and topper leaf did stay completely submerged under the brine. Look at the difference. This leaf is good enough to eat, and no top layer removal is needed for this jar of kale. Additionally, I think this is a great example of the results between insufficient and sufficient brine submergence. You may ask, why does this little bit of mold not bother me if molds can be releasing mycotoxins and/or antibiotics? Because I believe the mold development is in proportion to the mycotoxin release. At a small and early stage of mold growth, I believe it's insignificant enough to have an impact on the health and the safety of the fermentation. Remember, if you're uncomfortable in any way, shape, or form, then the solution is easy. Throw it out. I'm going to show you what that one instructor I referred to earlier would do, the one who believed that fermented vegetables below white surface mold is okay to eat. And just a note, he's not alone. It's also accurate to say that there are many experienced fermenters out there who follow this same method I'm about to show you. I'll share with you what I chose to do after you see the demonstration. Next demonstration is this red kraut with raisins, with a much more significant white mold development across the surface area. With a clean spoon, remove the entire surface area, plus an additional several inches down. Afterwards, you can take a paper towel and wipe out the inside of the jar. The kraut below is believed by many experienced fermenters as safe to eat. The dark spots, by the way, are raisins. The kraut looks good, it tastes good, smells good, the pH is around 3.9. In other words, there's no signs of spoilage. As for me, I chose to throw out the kraut after the demonstration because I was not comfortable saving and eating it. Why? Because I felt the surface mold was too advanced and had concerns that if there were mycotoxins released by the white mold, they may have infiltrated throughout the whole fermentation, despite no spoilage. I have no scientific study proving systemic mycotoxins in that specific jar of kraut that I threw out. I simply followed my own comfort level. With this one, black mold developed along with some white and fuzzy gray mold. Absolutely, do not even consider trying to save this fermentation by scraping off the top portion and eating the lower kraut. Black mold is dangerous, and all experienced fermenters and instructors agree on this one. Do not eat any part of this, throw it away. The blue color of this mold typically indicates it's a penicillium mold, which is a common food mold. However, many species of penicillium molds are confirmed to release mycotoxins, and as you may have already concluded due to the name of the mold, it naturally produces the antibiotic penicillin. However, not all blue mold species in the Penicillium genus are the same. The blue mold used in cheese making, like blue cheese, does not produce mycotoxins nor antibiotics, because those species are specifically selected strains and are deliberately inoculated into the cheese making process. Making cheese and doing a wild fermentation of vegetables are not the same. Fermenting vegetables is a wild fermentation, and we don't know what species is forming, harmful or not harmful. If it were a speck like this, I'd do what I demonstrated in my other examples given earlier by removing it with a clean spoon, and I would save the fermentation. But this bright blue mold situation has developed into an intermediate growth, and I threw away the entire fermentation. Please do the same. I will do a video on how to prevent fermentation funk so it can be avoided rather than dealt with. But I need to cover more types of fermentation funk first. The next video in this fermentation funk series will cover slimy brine. For a long time, I believed brine slime was a symptom of a fermentation gone bad. I threw it out and recommended others to do the same. But I learned from a microbiologist who studies fermentation microbes what's really going on. It wasn't what I thought. Stay tuned for that upcoming video. You'll find the link in the description. Click here to watch video number 1 on calm yeast, what it is, how to identify it, and what to do about it. Video number 3 covering slimy brine is right here. Subscribe to my channel, Clean Food Living, to see more fermentation recipe videos and fermentation educational videos. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.